I'm Sherry Jones, and I am a philosophy, rhetoric, and game studies instructor. And I currently teach game design and psychology for Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. I also teach philosophy and rhetoric in the Community College of Colorado system. Okay, so this question is pretty loaded because there's many ways to approach this question. So I'm just going to do my best to answer that. First of all, game-based learning essentially is an instructional method of using analog or digital games. So when we're talking about analog, we're talking about physical games, okay, board games and so forth, to teach and reinforce concepts and instruction. And there are several ways that you can use games in the classroom. So I'm just giving you a few examples here. So first of all, an instructor can assign games for students to play in the classroom and assess students' understanding of a concept or theory that is already present in a game. So an example would be, for example, in an English course, students can analyze and identify possible themes like coming of age, gender identity, cultural politics, etc. That's already present in the game story and reflect that back to the teacher. So also the students can think about how the interaction with the game can help them experience or recognize those games. What's happening in a game that's helping them see that. Another way is that the student or the instructor can still assign the game for students to play, but this time ask the student to apply a concept or theory to analyze the meaning of a game. So for example, in my own philosophy courses, I ask students to apply the existential concept of facticity, which refers to the concrete details of the world that structure one's life, like where one is born, the parents that one has, the friends that one has, and so forth, to analyze the meaning of a game. So for example, a student can figure out what the game rules and affordances, how they serve as facticity that govern how they exist in that game world. Another method is students can design and create games on their own that demonstrate their own level of comprehension of a concept or theory. So for example, in a psychology course, students can create a game that employs the psychology of color to influence the way the player interacts with the game. So as an example, students can add the color red to an enemy when they're designing an enemy to make the enemy appear more menacing and powerful, while adding the color purple to an enemy to make that enemy seem odd and silent. So the player, upon seeing a character that's red, might attack that enemy first rather than the purple enemy, due to the fact that the red color enemy has higher visibility and feel more threatening. So this is an example where the students demonstrating that they understand color theory to influence the way the player is receiving the game. And another one is the student can actually play and then explore emergent knowledge and meaning from a game that was not intended by the designer, him or herself. So for example, if you're teaching feminism and a student is playing a game, they might be analyzing the game like, for example, a Japanese digital monster capture game. So it's a card game where you're capturing monsters and collecting monsters. Students might be thinking about how the games or the monsters promote femininity in the way the Japanese see femininity, and whether that is sexist in the way that feminists explore sexism. Okay, so those are at least 4 possible ways to use game-based learning. So this is also, there are several ways to think about this issue. So first of all, and repeating myself again, game-based learning is the use of games in the classroom. It offers students the ability to actively engage with and interact with the text. In the word text here, and I'm referring to games in this instance, okay? In the English literature world and also English composition, text is anything that you can receive meaning from. So any medium such as a game, we refer to that as text, okay? And through game, you are not really passively receiving the text because you are required to interact with it. So it's also considered a form of active learning method. So let me define really quick what interactivity is. Interactivity is the use of both mental and physical faculties to engage with an object at hand. So some of course, when some teachers argue that the acts of reading, analyzing, and interpreting a text, like a textbook or a novel, is already an act of active engagement. And when we talk about, also, I can include video and podcasts, those kind of medium, we're actively engaging with it, okay? Those acts are not exactly the same as interacting with the text, in the sense that when we are physically interacting with a game, we have a chance to contemplate on how our physical interaction with the game affects the game's outcomes. So what we are doing with the game is actually affecting how the game will progress. So the extensive use of both our mind and body is required by game-based learning. This is something a little more than, for example, just passively receiving the text. And there's a little more here. So game-based learning also promotes, for example, and I will just restate this, with the interactive learning, flipping through a book, touch scrolling through an ebook. Again, some people argue this is already interaction, but it's really limited because we're only interacting with a physical book or an ebook based on necessity. We're flipping through a book because we want to get to the next page. We are scrolling through a book, ebook on a tablet because, again, we're just trying to get to the next page. We are not really interacting with that book or ebook for the purpose of experimenting or exploring the passable patterns of logic expressed by the text itself. So when we are interacting with a game, on the other hand, we get to interact with its game mechanics, characters, environment, story, and more elements in such a certain logical order that we have to find out through repeated playing in order to figure out how to progress through the game. So game gives us those challenges before we can actually progress through it instead of just passively flipping through it, right? It's also not, the metaphor is also, it's not just a side-scrolling adventure where you're just pressing the next key and the game is going through that, but you have to test out various combinations of game controls that allow us to get to the next level. So again, I really like game-based learning because it promotes that exploration and experimentation with the text. Also, it's interested learning because it makes learning fun. So the word fun in the game design world refers to the experience of being able to wrestle with and solve complicated puzzles, okay? So fun is not just, yay, I discovered something fun, and it's not quite that subjective. It's actually solving difficult puzzles. So games are fun by nature because they offer complexities. Games are also inviting to the player because they offer exciting visual and auditory environments through GUIs. So GUIs is graphical user interfaces, music, sound effects, and more to kind of engage the player as they're playing. So in essence, the fun game environment eases the students' access to the game's textual environment. Whereas sometimes if you think about a textbook, some students might find it challenging and not as accessible. And even if a game is complex, students can perceive the game as a challenge to be conquered rather than an unattainable goal. So in a sense, we're kind of pulling them into the text world by giving them a fun, interactive, visually pleasing, auditorily amazing environment for them to engage with, okay? And in that sense, games are very much ideal for helping students play and learn concept and apply concepts. And lastly, game-based learning also promotes design thinking. So it helps students consider how the design of a game affects the way we understand what the game is expressing in terms of its meaning or what it's wanting us to do. Students are also challenged to create their own games in certain circumstances where the creation of the game itself requires the students to engage in a design thinking, which involves the pre-planning of themes, colors, world architecture, spatial consideration. That means how far a building is to the character, how far are buildings to lands, to villages, and so forth. Spatial considerations, character design, story, plot, incentive goals, etc. So design thinking also involve a plethora of consideration that is really beautifully executed through game-based learning. So For me, I'm going to define first of all what I think intrinsic motivation is, because we can't really discuss things unless we have a settled definition of what we're talking about. So for me, I think of intrinsic motivation as referring to one's own desire for doing an activity without external influence. Okay. An external influence, for example, if I nag at a student to do something, it might have temporary influence on that student's behavior, okay? And that they'll do it because I'm asking them to do it. But they're not going to act with such fervor and passion for doing it if it isn't because it's coming from them, their internal desire for doing something without me forcing them to do so. So when they're playing a game, that student has to rely on his or her own ability to solve the puzzle, because a game is essentially a puzzle, in order to progress through that game. And without teachers' intervention or interference, a student is supposed to figure out how to solve the game by observing carefully the visual and auditory cues that tell them how to solve the game in the first place, because the clues are actually inside the game itself. It's not coming from me, right? So paying close attention to the game, or in otherwise in the reading world is called close reading, is how students excel when they're playing it. And in terms of the idea of ownership, students are able to own their learning experience by having to solve the game on their own. So by finishing a game, students are able to feel ownership of their game experience by doing it by themselves. And also games provide feedback to the player on their progress, such as through game points, levels, badges, and so forth, to give the player a sense of achievement. So in that sense, the student can feel ownership of their learning experience by conquering learning challenges based on their own agency.